This is Alabama Politics with Steve Flowers, an in-depth interview with Alabama's top political newsmakers. Now, from the studios of Troy University, here is Steve Flowers.
I'm Steve Flowers, and welcome to Alabama Politics. Folks, we're very fortunate tonight to have as our guest one of Alabama's great treasures, Dr. Edwin Bridges, better known to most of us as Ed Bridges, who served over 30 years as our state archives director and has a great history. He knows more about Alabama history than anybody in the state. And he's retired now, but we brought him back on the show. He was on probably a couple of years ago, and I got to tell you, it's probably one of the most popular shows we've ever had. Ed and I got talking about the history of the Indians here in the state. We didn't get much further than that. But Ed, thanks for coming on out. He still has his office down there at the archives, y'all. And I want to personally thank Ed. I've got a book out, some of y'all may know about it, called Of Goats and Governors, 6 Decades of Alabama Political History, colorful political history. And Dr. Bridges wrote the foreword for it. I was so flattered, and it's been such an honor to have him on my book with me, Goats and Governors. You can get it through New South Books here in Montgomery or on my website, either one. But Ed Bridges wrote the foreword to my book, Goats and Governors, 6 Decades of Alabama Political History. On the cover, we've got some of the most famous Alabama political characters of the last 6 decades. We've got Big Jim Folsom. We've got Governor John Patterson. We've got Governor George Wallace, Governor Lurleen Wallace, and Governor Albert Brewer. And we've lived through that era, haven't we?
Yeah, and there are so many wonderful stories. And in the book, there are wonderful stories.
Well, I want those stories told. Some of the stuff Big Jim did you can't make up. Facts better than fiction, you know. But, you know, prior to the show, Ed and I were talking, and it's been about 7 or 8 years ago when I had Governor Patterson on the show. He wrote a book, New South Books published his book, too, about his time as governor and his life and the stories. And you were so kind. He's now living up in rural Tallapoosa County. Tell our viewers about that. He's living in a place called Goldville where he was born and raised.
Yeah, it's back at his old family place. And he and Miss Patterson have taken, I think it's an old kind of fishing hut they had there on the lake and fixed it up. It's still kind of a rustic cabin, though it's, you know, they fixed it up. And they live there and they have a wonderful time. And they have a goat.
He's supposed to be raising goats up there. Tell him about that goat.
Well, I don't think they're raising goats, but they had a goat that just wandered in on them one day. A beautiful white goat, and it kind of adopted them. And it's wonderful. When they go around the house, the goat goes around outside the house looking in the windows at them.
Is he still, he's on top of his game,
He's
isn't he?
wonderful. He's
in his 90s.
He's in great shape. His mind is clear, and he's one of the most intelligent and insightful men I've ever known.
I've got some good stories in the book on Governor Patterson. He gave me himself. When he was on the show, we sat and talked about different things, which brings us to an interesting time in Alabama history, Alabama political history. He's the first one to acknowledge that he, of course, won the Attorney General's office on a sympathy vote for his father being assassinated in that Phoenix City story. And I think most of our viewers probably know the story that it must have been around 1954.
That's right. That's right.
54. Yeah. The Phoenix City was just a complete corruption, sinful city. It was one of the most sinful places in the world. It had corruption, gambling, prostitution, everything. His father had been run for Attorney General to clean it up, and then became assassinated by that mafia over there, which made it a sensational story. Then out of sympathy, they named him Attorney General. Then out of sympathy, 4 years later, he won the governor's race, 58. But y'all have got some down at the archives. Y'all have got some memorabilia about Tennessee, don't you?
And I think there are a lot of trial records there. I mean, there are investigative records. The Assistant Attorney General Bernard Sykes, who handled the investigation, all of those records are there at the archives. It's an enormous amount. In fact, people are still doing research on that right now.
Ed, you know, tell our viewers about the expansion. Was it completed while you were still director?
Yeah, the West Wing was added. Yeah, that was added in 2000. We started in late 2001, and finally finished it. Got everything furnished in about 2005. So it's been in operation for about 10 years.
Fruition.
Yeah.
And you could go down there. Now, your office is in the regular portion of the building.
No,
now.
it's in the
New
new
West
the
Wing.
new part. Yeah.
Yeah. Now the director, Steve is.
Yeah, Steve Murray's the new director.
He's in the regular, like
Yeah,
you
that's
were.
right. He's got the old office, yeah, old Mary Bankhead.
You probably got a
office.
nicer office.
No, he's got a wonderful office. I don't know if you've been in there. It's one of
Yeah.
these old, beautiful wood-paneled offices from the 1930s. You know.
Yeah, tell me about the lady. You know that it was named for her, and she was the archives director.
Mary Bankhead
Yeah,
Owen.
yeah. Tell
that's
the
an
story.
amazing
Tell that
story.
story because that's worth telling too.
Well, I don't know whether you've ever had anything on the Bankhead family, but it's probably the biggest, most important family in Alabama history.
I wrote some stuff, but my publisher thought that we probably ought to go start in the 40s.
That's right, and that story really starts in the 1870s when John H. Bankhead first became a major figure. He was the patriarch of the family, and he had, I think, 5 children. But 2 of them, first John Bankhead becomes a prominent member of the U.S. House of Representatives.
And this is not the father.
This is the father. He was a prominent member of the House of Representatives.
In 1870.
No, he was elected in the 1880s. And
Were they from Jasper at that time?
Yeah. And in fact, he was the head of the Building and Grounds Committee for the House of Representatives when they did all of the landscaping around the Capitol, all those beautiful circular walkways.
Was he from Jasper?
Yeah.
Where had they come from?
They were from they were in from the Jasper area. They had been there for a while.
Then.
Yeah. And
I'm sorry.
But anyway, he was a prominent member of the Congress, and then in 1907, I think it was, he went to the Senate. You know, after Edmund Pettus and John Tyler Morgan died, he was the first one to move up to the Senate after those 2 old leaders died. And once he got to the Senate, his big interest was the U.S. highway system. Cars were just becoming into use. He had been interested in promoting highways in Alabama, and he sponsored the first test act in about 1907 or 8 to test the idea of a national highway system. And then the big U.S. National Highway Act was the Bankhead-Shackelford Act of 1916, which created the U.S. National Highway System. Like 231 right? And all of these numbers.
The original man.
All grew out of Bankhead's bill. And interestingly, when he died in 1920, there were 2 transnational highways that went from the East Coast to the West Coast. I think one went from the Lincoln Highway went from New York, I believe, to San Francisco or something like that. And the Bankhead Highway went from Washington to San Diego. There were the 2 national highways, and one was for Lincoln and one was for Bankhead.
Is that right?
Yeah. So he died.
He died in office?
He died in office in 1920. And then his son, Will, runs for the House of Representatives. From Jasper. And he eventually, under Roosevelt, becomes the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives in the late 30s.
During Roosevelt?
During the New Deal, Will is the Speaker. And then his other son, John Jr., runs for the U.S. Senate. He's the guy who beat Cotton Tom Heflin. When he took Cotton Tom Heflin's seat in the U.S. Senate. And so John Jr. was in the U.S. Senate, and he was the head of the Senate Finance Committee. So
while Will was Speaker.
While Will was Speaker. So these 2 brothers.
Will was Speaker, and John Bankhead was a U.S. Senator.
U.S. Senator. And their sister was Marie Bankhead Owen, who was Director of the Archives.
So she was, how long was she Director?
She was Director for 35 years.
Longer than you?
Yeah.
From what year to what year?
From 1920 until 1955.
Then Milo was between...
Then she was followed by a guy named Peter Brannan, and then Milo followed Peter Brannan.
How long did Milo stay there?
Milo was there from 67 till his death in 81.
How many years is that, 20?
No, he was, 14 years.
Okay, so she was from 35 years beginning in what year?
Beginning in 1920.
Wow, and then she said it to 55.
Yeah.
Was the original building that we look at now, was that there then?
So, yeah, she got it. See, when her brother was the Speaker of the House of Representatives and her other brother was the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, she went up to Washington during the New Deal and got a WPA project to build the Archives building. That's how it got built.
Is that
and that's
right?
why it's such a beautiful building. You know, it's you know, the marble, the bronze, the brass finishing. I mean,
all the
you couldn't build a
all
building
the
like that now.
building that all the buildings, the federal buildings that were all built during that time.
Wonderful buildings.
Are the prettiest buildings around the country?
Yeah, you know, I've thought many times about this, that when you build something that's really beautiful, people may complain about how expensive it is, but if it's really beautiful, it holds up over time. And ultimately, it's probably a better value. You know, like you say, the federal courthouse here
Really?
in Montgomery is still one of the most beautiful buildings in Montgomery. It's
And
one
you
of-
know, too, if you go to cities like Washington or New York or Chicago, they're some of the most beautiful private homes that were built during that time. The most massive, the Biltmore House.
Yeah.
Was built during that era.
Yeah.
In Asheville, North Carolina, because all those great artisans were out of work, and they could get them for nothing. And they got them for WPA. You had great carpenters and you know, craftsmen that could build buildings, and they needed the work.
Yeah, and the Archives building, we have these wonderful bronze handrails, and we were having to adjust them to do an ADA compliance. And we talked with a contractor, and he said, you know, you couldn't build those today for $1,500 a foot. And even if you did, even if you got somebody to do it, it would never be this quality. So we tried to do a workaround to protect those. You know, we just couldn't modify the originals because they can't be replicated today.
So that lady, was she the only other sibling they had? Or did they have
No, there was another one, a sister named Louise, and she did a bunch of different things, but she never held public office.
So that John Bankhead, the original John Bankhead, his family had been in Jasper, Walker County.
Right, right.
They'd been there a while.
Yeah.
And he rose to prominence. He was in the United States Congress probably for 20 years, then went to the Senate in 1907.
Right, right.
Stayed for 13 years and died in office.
Yeah.
Then his son, Will Bankhead, went to Congress, and John Bankhead Jr. won his Senate seat.
So, you know, starting really from the 1870s until John Jr.'s death in the 1940s, that family was really a powerhouse family.
Did John Jr. die in office too?
I think so. I think so. And you know, then there was Walter Will, who had one term in Congress, and he just decided he didn't like it.
Was that Will's son? Oh, well, I'll be done.
No, it's John's son. Walter
John's
Will was
son,
John's son. Yeah.
Isn't that something how that Bankhead family was so prominent?
Amazing family. Yeah.
You know, during that time, you think about this. We were going to talk about before the show the 1901 era, but that really is a more interesting era to me, the Depression era. If we can talk about that a little bit and surround those Bankheads when they were in Congress, if you went back to that 1930s era.
Amazing group. I mean,
It really was.
I mean, just in the southeast Alabama area, think about Henry Stegall,
Lister
how
Hill.
important he was, or Lister Hill, or later John Sparkman, or Hugo Black.
You know, interesting, we were talking about this. I had lunch with Beth Chapman today, before she was former Secretary of State, and she wanted to have lunch and talk about my book and that sort of thing. And she asked me an interesting question. She says, in your book, or have you thought about, since you've been writing, talking about politics for years now, who was the greatest statesman that you? That's a strange, question. I never had thought about that. She looked at me and says, "Who do you think the greatest statesman was?" And Ed, I sat there for a second. I said, I've never been asked that. The name of Lister Hill and John Sparkman came to my mind.
Yeah.
During my lifetime. Those guys were so erudite and they were sophisticated yet common enough to really relate to people politically, but they were so well respected in Washington.
And I don't think people in Alabama today, I mean, but we've forgotten about Lister Hill almost, with the Lister Hill hospitals and all, but he was a national giant, and
he really
particularly in the area of public health and health research and hospitals and he was an amazing man.
Well, in my book, I have a little chapter called "The Three Greatest Senators."
Yeah, that's right.
During this era,
Uh-huh.
and I didn't think about it, but the Bankheads really didn't serve that long. You see, you talking about Lister Hill went to the United States Senate in 1938, and stayed
After having already had a serious
12
career
years
in
in
the
Congress.
House. Yeah,
He had 12. He went to Congress at 26 years old.
yeah.
So he'd been in Congress 12 years and went to the Senate at 38 and served over 30 years. John Sparkman served over 30 years.
And think about Lister Hill's role in getting Maxwell. You know what that's meant for Montgomery.
Exactly.
I mean, Montgomery should never stop thanking him
You
for
know,
what he did.
I had people in Montgomery, I'm not sure, realize this. I sat here with Todd Strange, the mayor, several years ago. We were talking about the downturn in the economy of the state, how many state employees have been lost because of the cuts in state budgeting. And I said, I assume, not being a Montgomeryan, that state government was the biggest employer in Montgomery, Alabama. And I made that statement. I said, no, it's not. I said, oh, has Hyundai become the biggest employer now? Since they got a lot of people out there. No, he said, Maxwell Gunter's the biggest employer in Montgomery and has never wavered. Did you know that?
No, I didn't know
It's the
that.
biggest employer.
Yeah.
Plus, you have a lot of spinoff
Yeah.
that a lot of retirees
Yeah.
stay here because they like the climate or whatever. But I didn't mean to get off on that. But that is so true. And for some reason, I said that to her about that I thought Lister Hill was the great, maybe, and John Sparkman, that tandem.
Yeah.
And such different backgrounds.
Uh-huh.
You know, you had Lister Hill, who was born to privilege here in Montgomery. His father was a famous heart surgeon, old political family.
Uh-huh.
The Hills and Gunners were political factions in Montgomery during that era. And then you have John Sparkman, who was the perfect Horatio Alger story, grew up as a tenant farmer in Hartsley, Morgan County, and worked his way through the University of Alabama shoveling coal. But both of them were SGA presidents at the University of Alabama, and both of them were in a thing called the Machine.
And they seemed to work in tandem in the Senate.
They did.
They were real close together. I was just reading recently about their efforts together. You know, after World War II, they closed Redstone and the Huntsville Arsenal, and I think they had actually put the Huntsville Arsenal up for sale. And Sparkman and Hill started working on that and said, we got to do something about this. And, you know, and they kept pushing, and they said, well, we've got these Germans out at Fort Bliss. We need to do something with them. They are working on missiles for us. So let's move them to Huntsville. We'll put them out there.
And I've often said, and people have said that, I said, if y'all knew the political history of how important John Sparkman was to creating what Huntsville is today, they would name that town Sparkmanville. No, it really should be appropriately, Huntsville should be named Sparkmanville. It really should be. I mean, they ought to just change it now. I mean, because he created what is now Huntsville. During the turn of the century in 1901, Huntsville and Troy were the same size.
Oh, wow.
Huntsville was, and they had irony how malapportioned the legislature was. When I was a little boy paging in the 1960s, this is how malapportioned the legislature was. Troy in 1901, they had not reapportioned in 60 years, you know that.
Yeah.
Troy had 2 representatives and a senator, and Huntsville had the same number. And even as a little boy, I said, something wrong here. I'm glad we got this, but we got 25,000 people in Pike County. We got 2 representatives. And Huntsville got 250,000. They got 2 representatives. That's how malapportioned it was. You know, I'm always shocked whenever people now will file suit about that. I mean, some 3rd grade civics kid can write a suit and say they're supposed to have 1 man, 1 vote. Therefore, the people in North Alabama have no representation based on the proper thing. Why they didn't file a suit? Not just racially, but geographically. Why folks in Scottsboro and Huntsville and all that would put up with that? You know, Big Jim ran on that. Big Jim ran on that in the 1940s. He said, "Yo, we got to reapportion the legislature."
Yeah, I remember.
He ran on that in the 40s, 50s. We've got a lot about Big Jim in this thing, but going back to that era with Sparkman and Hill, during that Depression era, they also had a trait. And it's almost a lost art now with everything being done by computer and internet and everything. And you may have known, I hand wrote this book, and I hand write my columns. That's how I think. And I wrote this book on legal pads, and it was deciphered and turned into a book. But I wrote it mostly from memory. But during that era, if you wrote Sparkman and Hill, they had a tradition, and I, as a little boy, can tell you this. I've saved it over the years. I wrote John Sparkman and Lister Hill because I was already in love with politics. I got a return letter within 2 days from Washington, D.C. Sparkman was handwritten to a 12-year-old boy in Troy. Can you imagine that?
Yeah.
One of the most powerful men in the United States took time to write me a handwritten note. Steve, thank you for your letter. Wow. Can you imagine John Sparkman and Lister Hill sitting there in Washington, and some little boy in Troy has written him a letter? I'm going to write him back.
I think the smartest, wisest politician I've ever known in Alabama, you may have known him, was a probate judge from Tallapoosa County named C.J. Coley.
Oh yeah, great historian too.
Wonderful man, yeah. But he had a rule. He said, answer all your letters every day and answer the ones that are written in pencil first. He said, because anybody who writes a letter in pencil doesn't write a letter every day, and it's important to them. It had to be important to cause them to do it and answer those first.
Well, Sparkman Hill did it too. It was that era. They would answer letters. Now, it's not uncommon for a congressman to do it now because they've got staff.
Yeah, and they've got it already loaded in the word processor.
Exactly.
Print out letter 10 for this guy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Lister Hill would write you back, but he unquestionably, one of the papers here, one of the free papers, the Gazette, I don't know if you've seen that, did a thing about reflections in Montgomery, and they asked me to write something for my book, and I took Lister Hill, poured out of the book, because to me, Lister Hill is heads above the greatest political figure to arise from Montgomery. But the time passes.
Yeah.
You know, you don't know. In that delegation, Ed, during that Depression era, Alabama's delegation had as progressive a voting record as New York.
Oh yeah, they were
New Dealers.
Hugo Black, for goodness sake.
Exactly.
I was just looking through some old pictures for this project I was working on, and I found this picture of Hugo Black with a senator from Massachusetts, and they were the co-sponsors of a wage and hour law in 1936-37 to raise the minimum wage to 40 cents.
Yeah.
And he was a sponsor for that.
We would never have made our delegation.
The Bankhead Cotton Control Act was a key agricultural act. Glass-Steagall for banking. All of these were Alabama guys.
I know.
Yeah.
I know. And we've got stories in the book about some of them. Little Jim Folsom gave me a good story about Big Jim that you'll find comical, that Big Jim was running against Henry Steagall as a young
I remember.
man.
Oh, I love that story. I read it. I love it. One of my favorite stories. You want to tell it?
Well, it takes too much time. Yeah. But basically, what it was, Henry Steagall had become a national figure as head of the banking committee, and wrote the Glass-Steagall Act. And Big Jim, before he moved to Cumberland, had run a couple of races for Congress in the Wiregrass against Henry Steagall, and Mr. Henry had become a national figure, so he would come home to Dale County and hunt quail with Brooks Brothers suit song. And so some of the guys were thinking Mr. Henry had gotten too big for his britches, and they were accusing him of eating fine food with the New York bankers because he was chairman of the banking committee. And they went off on a tangent, said he was running around cavorting with young girls and everything. Just made it, and they used to have big rallies on the square at that time. You know, they had one, and there were 4 or 5 men running against Henry Steagall for re-election to Congress, which was unusual because Congress was pretty much entrenched. And Big Jim was in the race. He was a 20-something-year-old guy trying to get his feet wet in politics, running for Congress in the Wiregrass district. And they got one of these big rallies in Elba, and they were all just lambasting Henry Steagall, just flat out saying, Henry Steagall's too big for his britches. He sits and eats fine food with fine New York dining. The New York bankers wine and dine him, and he's also running around with young girls in Washington. And finally, Big Jim was the last one to speak, and he didn't take long. He just said, well, I've been listening to all these old guys talk about Mr. Henry, and if that's what a congressman's job is to eat fine food and date young women, I believe that's a job for a young man. Y'all better send me to Congress. I can do a better job than they can.
That he could have too.
If that's a job is dating young women and eating fine food, that's a job for a young man. But those kind of stories in the book. But that was a great era. You think about old Bob Jones from Tennessee Valley went to Congress. Spartan was up there. Carl Elliott from Jasper. Raines from Gadsden. We had an old Frank Boykin.
Yeah.
You know, from Mobile. Frank Boykin's about that tall. Everything made for love. In the book, I say Frank Boykin and Big Jim were best friends. And can't you imagine seeing them together at that hunting lodge? Frank Boykin had a big, he was a very wealthy man. Owned a lot of land down there in Washington County. And he would have a big quail hunt, have half the Congress down there.
We actually have Frank Morgan's records of the archives.
Do you?
So yeah.
But he would have big parties, hunting parties from about 40 or 50 members of Congress coming in. The chairman of Ways and Means would be down there, and he would invite Big Jim. And there's a picture I've seen, I wish I had put it in the book. Big Jim's 6'9". You know, he's sitting there and he's looking at that old Frank Morgan who's about 5'2", you know, and they both were drunk. You know, they were sitting there in that hunting lodge, and it was the funniest scene you ever seen. Big Jim had an old hunting jacket on and looking down. You know, when you see pictures of Big Jim with Rankin Fight and all those guys who were his buddies, he's like looking down like they're children. He was so big. You're tall, you know, you're 6'5".
Yeah, but not like that.
But for that era, people weren't as big then. You know, most men were about 5'5", 5'6", and old Big Jim, all these pictures, he's sitting there looking at them, you know, down there like that. You know, looking at them. But that was a great era. I love that era of Congress.
Yeah.
When you think about that. You think about all those congressmen and Hill and Sparkman, and then I got to throw Shelby. It's been there 30 years now. I've thrown him, I put 3. We're living in an era where I think Richard Shelby may go down as one of our third, as far as bringing home the bacon and that sort of thing. He's fixed to be chairman of finance, appropriations, you know, in the next few years. So Shelby makes the book in that regard. He's like you. He was nice enough to write a little cover for it, but Ed Bridges wrote the foreword of my book, and that's one of the proudest things I am, because you are a state treasurer. We didn't get off on the 1901 era, but that we touched on the 40s a little bit. We'll have to have you back and do another show.
That'd be fun,
and
Steve.
cover the 1901 era if you don't mind.
That'd be fun.
The Constitution, because it's been lambasted so many times. What do you miss about being a director of all things? Just because you're there every day.
Yeah, but I mean, when I go home at night, I don't have anything to worry about, you know, and I go home when I want to. But when I'm there during the day, what I'm doing mostly is my history projects. I'm doing writing and research. I'm working on a book about Alabama history. And,
that'll be great.
I'm having a wonderful time. I can't tell you how much fun it is.
Let me write a blurb for your book.
Okay.
If I can. Oh yeah, I owe you one.
Okay.
That'll be great. What you gonna name it?
I don't know. We're still working on the title.
It's going to be Alabama history.
It's going to be it's an overview of Alabama history from the Ice Age to the Information Age.
Boy, that will be invaluable.
Yeah.
I can't wait. When's it supposed to be coming out?
About this time next year.
Who's going to publish it?
University of Alabama Press.
Okay.
Is doing it. Yeah.
That will be great. I'm looking forward to that.
Well, thank you, Steve.
We'll have you on to talk about it.
Okay, that'll be fun.
Folks, our guest tonight has been Ed Bridges, the former archives director and one of the state treasurers. We thank y'all for watching. Hope you tune in again next week for Alabama Politics. That would be great.